Tak přišel čas přivítat naši zahraniční účastnici Taniu a předávám jí slovo. Tania má 45-minutovou přednášku, po ní přijde Petr Matoušek s Idou Kajzerovou a potom bude poslední příspěvek ještě po přestávce. Předávám slovo.
Hello, and thank you to the Czech Streetwork Association for having me here today. I want to thank all of you for coming and listening to a speech in English. You must be very tired by now, and I appreciate you coming. I also want to thank Moimir and Sophie, who are the translators, interpreters. They have been so wonderful today and yesterday. I always feel so happy to be in a room full of street workers. This is a space where we can celebrate street work. This is really important. And we also need to think and talk critically about the work that we do. So I'm here to share some thoughts and some research on the problematic nature of evaluating street work. And I also want to learn from you. So I will speak for about half an hour and leave time for your reflections on this theme. And discussion after my talk. Or you can come and talk to me informally afterwards, or send me an email. My email address is there. I'm aware that some of what I say may be controversial for some people. Some of you, I hope, will agree with me. I'm sure some of you won't agree with me. And I hope whatever you feel, you will at least agree that this is an important debate to be having. Evaluation matters. Partly for the obvious reasons. We need to understand the work we're doing in order to be as effective as we reasonably can be. But also, it matters because how we evaluate has a huge impact on the work we do, on how we do our work, on who we work with, and why. There are 4 sections to my talk today. First, I'll speak about the new youth impact agenda. I'll explain what I mean by that, and I'll argue that this is a global change that will have important effects on street work. Then I'll talk a bit about history, looking at 3 broad phases in the history of the evaluation of street work in England. Thirdly, I think we need to discuss how these changes came about, how these changes relate to the wider political, economic context in which we work, one in which finance and profit have come to dominate our everyday lives and our work on the streets. And lastly, as a street worker myself, I know that we need hope and we need practical ideas alongside critique, so I'll share some thoughts on positive possibilities for the future. My argument today is based on 20 years of experience as a youth and community worker. Mostly I have worked in street-based and community settings. In England, we talk of detached youth work. I don't know if you know this term. We say we're detached if we work on the streets because we're detached from the establishment. But over the last few years, I've done a little bit of youth work, but I've been working mostly in the university. I'm not a typical university employee. I was a youth worker for a long time before I even went to university. I went to university when I was 30. Before that, as a young person, I grew up in a poor area. I relied on social benefits. I lived on social housing. So the realities of practice and the realities of disadvantaged communities are always central to my work now in the university. I run a course in King's College London, MA Education Policy and Society. If any of you want to come and do a master's in London, it would be nice to see you. Also, I'm a researcher and I am currently starting my second research project. So the first project I did led to my book, which is the picture there, Grassroots Youth Work. I've brought 3 copies if anyone wants them. I have to charge a little bit of money because I have to pay for them, but if you want to buy them at the cost price, I have 3 copies here if anyone's interested. In this presentation, there are a small number of quotations from research, and that's from this research for this book, Grassroots Youth Work. And now I'm starting a new research project with my colleague Louise Doherty, and we're looking at the impact and evaluation of youth work, which is, of course, the focus of the talk today. Of course, I'm also building on the ideas of other people, many other people. I'll include some recommended literature at the end of my slides, and happy to make these slides available for everyone who wants them. And I specifically wanted to thank In Defence of Youth Work and the Federation for Detached Youth Work, two very important networks that always inspire me. We are entering a new phase of how youth work is evaluated. This is not unique to street work, it's not unique to the youth and community sector. It mirrors developments in wider social practices, education, health services, international development, both governmental and non-governmental bodies. I will base my talk mainly on the English context because that's what I know best, but many of these changes are global changes. I'll mainly talk about youth work. Again, this is what I know best, but I believe that many of these changes are relevant beyond youth work. I do know that many street workers in the Czech Republic work with adults as well, and I think you can tell me, does this relate to you? So what is the Youth Impact Agenda? Before I criticise the Youth Impact Agenda, I need to be clear about what I mean by it, and I will try to describe it fairly and in neutral terms, first of all. I use the term Youth Impact Agenda to denote a policy agenda, which is a set of beliefs held by governmental and non-governmental organisations that there is a need to improve how the youth sector evidences and measures its impact. And they believe that the youth sector needs to be better at proving outcomes. So number one, identifying outcomes. And here, outcomes are described as the changes that take place as a result of what we do. So it's not about saying how many evenings we work or what social projects we have done or how young people feel about our work. It's about outcomes for individuals. So crucially, secondly, it's about measuring this change. It's about evidencing the outcomes. Here, in the Youth Impact Agenda, measuring is often used as a synonym for evidencing or evaluating. This use of measuring is deliberate because today numbers are valued more than qualitative evidence. And thirdly, explaining what we do that helps us to make this difference. So this is about organisations having a deliberate plan around exactly how they intend to meet the outcomes, how they will measure it. Sometimes this is presented as a theory of change. So here there is often a preference for measuring young people's behaviour or attitudes at the beginning of a project and then measuring them again at the end and putting a number. How has something changed? And I think that these kind of tools can be useful in some settings, but my argument is that usually in street work this is an inappropriate way, it's a damaging way to evaluating our work. To think about this, I think we need to go back to the principles and characteristics of street work. So firstly, street work is person-centred. Measuring impact assumes that we have a specific intervention, yet street work tends to take place from the bottom up. It's based on dialogue and collective learning, rather than being an intervention as such. Number two, street work does not always have a specific focus or a singular outcome. In my experience as a street worker, young people often tell me years later about the impact that the work had on them. But the impact for one person is often completely different from the impact for another person. I think we're not looking at young people in relation to one singular aspect of their lives. We don't identify them by their problems. We're not trying to fix them. And thirdly, street work does not always have a clear beginning and end. So evaluation tools that measure young people's behaviour or attitudes at the beginning and the end of a project are not really appropriate to street work. Fourthly, street work is not only about individuals. So it's not just about trying to change individuals. Change is collective and comes from people. Change is negotiated with those we work with. It may take place at a neighbourhood level or a societal level. So this is a summary. Streetwork's defining characteristics can put it in conflict with impact measurement. And the last thing on that list is around personal questions and avoiding intrusion in people's lives. So what do young people think of all of this? In my experience, when I have been required by funders or managers to use very formal methods of measurement, this obstructs relationship building, particularly with young people who are most disengaged from our services, from other services, who choose us because we're less formal, we're less bureaucratic. So when we try to introduce a lot of forms, they say, I thought you were the police, or all these forms, it's like school. Streetwork should take place on people's terms, on their territory. So how ethical is it and how safe is it to enter that territory with questionnaires and evaluation tools before we even know people? Many of the young people we work with are suspicious of authority figures. There's a serious issue of surveillance and privacy if we start doing these formal recordings. Traditionally, street workers often work, as you know, with young people who have had bad experiences with the police or other authority figures. So traditionally, we keep our information confidential unless we're very worried about someone's safety and we need the help of other agencies. And traditionally, we start by not asking lots of questions that might be seen as intrusive, and many of us may not even ask young people to share their names. I want to be clear here. My argument is not against evaluation. Evaluation is vital. It improves our practice, it helps with accountability to young people and communities, it supports our learning as practitioners, and it ensures that limited resources are used effectively. But the current conflation of evaluation and measurement is unhelpful. The word evaluation is about value, how we value something. My argument is that street work has intrinsic value. I don't mean it is always valuable, but if it's done well, it benefits communities in ways that measurement cannot demonstrate. And I think this is true of other practices and facilities, playgrounds, parks, children's centres. These are community resources. They contribute to fulfilling the needs and the rights of communities. In contrast, new methods of evaluation are about measuring, and are about measuring things in monetary terms. So it's a different notion of value. So we might say things like, if we spend £1 on street work, we save £10 from the police budget. And okay, sometimes there's a small amount of truth to these claims, but the problem is that it tends to portray the communities we work with really negatively. And it portrays us as kind of saviours, as if we're coming in to, help people not be in prison or not be in hospital. And potentially that might be a benefit for some people, but claiming these things without a thoughtful explanation is problematic. Increasingly, monetary value is expressed in a different way. Economists have developed tools to estimate the monetary value of non-monetary benefits. So things like well-being, confidence, life satisfaction. There are now complex equations to value these things. So the second example here on the slide is from a social organisation in the UK, a youth programme, that use, I think, quite questionable data to claim a really high return on investment. They say we are able to report a social benefit to cost ratio of between 5.93 and 8.36. It sounds very scientific, but it's based on subjective judgment just as much as if we were telling a story about our work, I would argue. I now want to talk briefly about history to discuss how these changes came about. In the English context, there have been 3 phases. In reality, these phases have overlapped. It's not a clear picture, but what I am suggesting is that these phases are characterized by particular approaches. And you can tell me whether anything similar is happening in your contexts. So first, practice-based evaluation. Up to around the 1980s and 1990s, evaluation was dominated by practice. So things like recordings at the end of a session, having team meetings, discussing our work, writing up our work in reports, and perhaps we would involve young people informally and creatively. This approach aims primarily to improve practice. There was a great focus on critical reflection on ourselves and our work. But because this approach was supported in the education and training of youth and community workers, to some extent, it has remained part of the professional practice of youth and community workers, of street workers in the UK, even today. But time for these practices is limited because these practices are not really valued by funders and by government. I don't want to be romantic about this phase of evaluation. It's not always involved a positive view of young people, for example. Too often it's been tempting for street workers to identify their impact with recourse to deficit perspectives, saying we're keeping young people off the streets or we're working with problem families. And as I've said, I think that is problematic. The second phase was dominated by targets and managerialism. In the English context, this came to dominate street work in the 90s and 2000s under our New Labour centre-left government. This was a phase dominated by audit cultures, by top-down accountability. It's the idea that public services should learn from businesses, should assess and compare performance against targets. At this time, street workers had to meet many targets for young people's participation and outcomes, and we had to evidence these targets on shared databases. These processes were widely criticised by youth workers for being bureaucratic, unrealistic, distorting, and causing cultures of surveillance of young people and of workers. Today, these target cultures still remain. But ironically, despite all this evidence, all these databases that we were told would evidence our work, when a new government came in and wanted to close down youth centres and reduce government spending, all this paperwork, all these databases didn't help us. It had no effect, and huge numbers of projects have been closed down. So now in this context of austerity, we have the Youth Impact Agenda. And I won't go into detail on the details of the English case, but we now have a centre-right government. They have been in power since 2010. They greatly reduced funding to local authorities, and many street-based services were closed or reduced. Financial pressures were used as a justification for the introduction of more outcomes-based measurement. And the government set up a centre for youth impact, and as the quotation there says, the director of the Centre for Youth Impact says, the financial pressures make it ever more essential to focus on identifying the approaches that will have the greatest impact in improving outcomes and reducing calls on the public purse. So they said impact needs to be quantified and monetised as a way of saving money. I have said, I think, that this new youth impact agenda is to some extent new, but there are many continuities. There are important changes, a focus on outcomes, on measurement, on financialisation, or expressing value in monetary terms. Yet there are continuities here, the intrusive nature of these practices, surveillance, deficit views of young people, the data burden, the sheer tedium of bureaucratic practices we have to do, and the underlying ideologies of neoliberalism and the entrepreneurial self. And it's these underlying ideological changes I will now briefly discuss. In all of this, I think it's vital to understand the political and economic context. Why have these changes come about? Because it's no coincidence that similar processes have happened in schools, in health services, in social services, in the UK, in Europe, in the USA. There are differences, there are important contextual differences, but these widespread changes are not simply organisational or pragmatic. They also reflect wider political economic contexts. Bob Lingard and his colleagues in Australia have written about the significant role of numbers in education policy. They argue that numbers enable governments to steer education practice at a distance. They use data and performance measures as policy. This dominance of numbers is partly related to current preference for statistics, as if statistics are much more factual and reliable than anything else. To an extent, I understand this. It's seductive in an era of post-truth. Yet, I would question the idea that numbers never lie. Linked to this, there is an increasing focus on evidence-based policymaking. Yet, again, this is a questionable concept. Education policy researchers have found that, in general, evidence is used by governments to confirm what they wanted to do anyway, so they find the right evidence to fit their policy agenda. So importantly here, I think we need to talk about markets and neoliberalism. A focus on numbers and counting enables the possibility of comparison, of competition, and of monetizing. We could easily spend the whole talk trying to define neoliberalism, so I will be brief. What I mean by neoliberalism, in a fairly simple sense, is the global dominance of big business, alongside the privatization of public and voluntary services and the growing individualization of everyday life. The current phase of neoliberalism is characterized by managerialism and marketization. It also has some particular features around using austerity as a justification for the rollback of public services. Under neoliberalism, we have moved from professionalized or practice-based evaluation to monetized, marketized evaluation, to measuring impacts based on the ability to save money for the public purse and create what's called returns on investment. One of the important issues here is that evaluation does not just change the work we do, it also changes who we are, how we feel about our work. Stephen Ball has written about this process of performativity. How we're measured affects who we feel we are, who we can be at work, and the kind of practices that are harder to do. Performativity has been present throughout YouthWork's history, yet it is particularly powerful now, and it changes our relation with those people we work with. I am arguing here, drawing on Stephen Ball, that whatever our own individual political views, policy neoliberalizes us all by, as he says, making us enterprising and responsible, by offering us the opportunity to succeed, and by making us feel guilty if we do not. How monitoring and evaluation affects our relations with young people was illustrated again and again in my research with part-time youth workers. To select just one quotation, Alan, a part-time youth worker, said, "You sit down with the kid and you have a really meaningful conversation with them, and you're like, can you fill out this sheet and just tell me?" It's like it completely undermines everything you've just done. And many of the workers in my research felt that targets and the way in which they were asked to evaluate their work were actually harmful for the authenticity of their relationships with young people, and they were harmful for the autonomy of the youth workers. Those of us who are critical of the status quo are often accused of complaining, but without having any positive solutions. I think this is probably a false separation between critique and practice. Critique does have a practical importance. We know that radical theorists such as Gramsci and Paulo Freire have written and spoken about praxis, the dynamic relationship between theory and practice. And for our work to be effective, I think we need to submit it to critical thought, to dialogue, to debate. So I do think critique is useful, and I also think the most positive future for street work and for evaluation would only come about with a real fundamental change in society, in politics and the economy. But what do we do on a rainy Monday night before the complete change in society? Street workers and managers are under growing pressure to prove outcomes. Yet I think we need to resist any idea that there's one single perfect approach to doing this. Because any single tool would become a new form of top-down governance. It would stifle change and creativity. Streetwork's evaluation needs to be rooted in its particular context, in neighbourhood, in space, in its own focus relationship with time, and in its overall approach. So I think instead of finding one tool, I think it's important instead we become better at articulating the difference our work makes and why. And this is a difficult task. It's difficult because a lot of people don't understand street work. It's difficult because we need to be able to talk about the difference we make to people's lives and to communities, but without speaking negatively about those people and those communities. And it's difficult because we need to speak up for the effectiveness of our work, but without suggesting we are saviours, we are the only ones who can make a difference. We do need to show evidence. We should reject the idea, however, that evidence means only numbers. Numbers can be useful, but there are well-established qualitative approaches to research, and we can use those. And we also need to go back to that idea of evaluation as valuing, and this will involve spending time thinking and talking about what street work is, how it works, why it works, who is involved, who is excluded, and what we might want street work to become in the future. The answers to these questions will differ between countries, between neighbourhoods, between different practitioners, and at different times. And I think street work needs to remain nimble, dynamic, flexible, to change and develop, as well as being rooted in our practice, in our traditions, and in our history. One of the important means of valuing street work is speaking with young people, both those we're working with now, but also those who worked with us a long time ago. And as one example, I read out this quotation from a young youth worker reflecting on her work and on her recent participation in youth work as a young person from age 12. She said, "It's a free space. It's not like school where you have to go and do set things. It's more relaxed, I guess. And there's more of a relationship between the young people and the youth workers. I can't explain it. It's quite spontaneous. Like you can kind of drop your worries-ish, if that makes sense. Just come here and do something fun, chat with your friends and have a debate." I think one of the really nice things in this account is that it values what youth work is not. It's not like school. What it is, it's about relationship, it's relaxed, it's spontaneous. And also the notion of, I can't explain it. I think that's important, to think about those things we can't explain, to acknowledge that there is much in human processes that we'll never explain and we can't measure, and maybe that's fine. I also want to share this quotation from a street-based youth worker, Laura. She told me about how she was talking to her managers about the benefits of street work. She said, "I had to show what opportunities we give young people. I gave a few examples of concrete things we give them, very concrete, tangible things. And then I said, but the most important things are the things you can't touch, and I made a massive emphasis on that, because they're so obsessed with bloody targets. And then I sort of made from the concrete ones, which untangible ones come out of that, and then some comments from the young people. Once again, there is a focus here on the tangible, the intangible, and what young people say, and I think all three of those are important. So I want to finish with a few approaches that I think are more effective than measurement. Most of these are not new. Many of you will be using these approaches already. I already mentioned practitioner and team evaluations. For many street workers, however, this time for reflection has been squeezed out of our work because of having to meet targets and fill in forms and databases. I think we need to reclaim this time. Secondly, creative approaches such as films, podcasts, photo diaries, they're a great way of involving young people and community members in evaluation, and often are a really effective way of communicating with managers and funders. It's not true that managers and funders and policymakers only understand numbers, which is something I've been told repeatedly. It's just not true. Thirdly, collective, reflective and practice learning approaches. Some of you this morning took part in a workshop I ran on collective storytelling about our work, and this has been developed by a group of us involved in defence of youth work. I've put the link at the end of the presentation, but if you look up storytelling in youth work, all the resources are there for you to have a look at and use if it's useful to you. And I've mentioned qualitative interviews, focus groups, external evaluations, and also I wanted to mention Graham Tiffany, who is involved in the Federation for Detached Youth Work, his report and recommendations on evaluation in street work. Again, I've included a link at the end of this. I'm coming to the end of time, so I'll skip over this one. And I want to finish here with some questions for you. How is street work evaluated in your context? What helps about how you evaluate street work? What hinders? What gets in the way? Is there an argument for the intrinsic value of street work, and how could we communicate this? And finally, this discussion of evaluation and impact cannot be separated from wider questions about the governance of street work and everyday life. We're living through a time in which street work is under threat. In the UK, it's being decimated. What remains is increasingly governed by onerous forms of evaluation that are not appropriate to street work. The danger here is that in these processes, the least certain and the least formal practices, such as street work, are hardest to evidence and therefore are most vulnerable to being closed down. So I want to finish with a call to all of us as practitioners, managers, partner organisations in this room to defend a particular approach to street work that, in the words of In Defence of Youth Work, is volatile and voluntary, creative and collective, and association and conversation without guarantees. Thank you for listening. So feel free to ask questions, but also to briefly share your own experience with everyone in the room. It doesn't need to be a question. Oh yeah, thank you.
Someone? No one. No. I won't make arrests. So? No? No?
Do you think it's similar in the Czech Republic to the story I've given in England? Is it very different? Do you have to provide a lot of statistics? Who would like to explain to us visitors?
Dobrý den, moje jméno je Ida Kajzrová, já jsem sociolog, nemám se streetworkem moc společného, ale taky jsem se věnovala při studiu sociální politiky. A myslím si, že taková byrokratizace společnosti, o které vy tam mluvíte, ta jako na kontinentě nastala daleko dřív, jako už v 19. století, už za druhé světové války, už za komunismu. Máme svoji vlastní historii toho, kdy musíme vyplňovat jaké dotazníky a jak jsme sledovaní. A myslím si, že bohužel málo reflektujeme to, že máme svoji vlastní historii tady toho problému. No. Takže myslím si, že to není podobný, ale že určitě se budeme snažit vecpat do toho, že to je podobný.
Thank you. I think that's really important to say that these top-down forms of measurement are not only neoliberal. At the moment, we are globally dominated by neoliberalism, but we need to fight against any kind of top-down governance. We need to fight for freedom, for autonomy, and for equality. So I think that's an important reminder about the history. Does anyone have a good example of evaluation you do in your centre, or maybe something difficult that you don't like doing?
No, moje meno je Barbora a nemám dobrú skúsenosť, Ale som veľmi rada, že o tom tu hovoríte. A pre mňa je záhada, že keď ste hovorili o tých rôznych ako etapách, alebo že ako prechádzala to Anglicko tými jednotlivými, že pre mňa je otázka, že kde sme my. A ono to je ešte možno zasa iné, kde je Česká republika, a potom je pre mňa záhada, kde je Slovensko. Pretože mám pocit, že my v rámci sociálnych služieb sme ešte viac pozadu. A nie je to len akože o sociálnych službách, ale vôbec o takom tom vôbec nazeraní sa na to. A myslím si, že to, čo tam vpredu zaznelo, že ešte taký ten kontext toho, že my sme do tej Európskej únii tak vhupli a že od nás sa akože očakáva oveľa viac, ako by sme možno vlastným tempom tam prišli, ako keby, že my potrebujeme spraviť ako keby oveľa viac krokov, aby sme došli k nejakému hodnoteniu, a možno by nám to trvalo oveľa dlhšie. Tak nad tým takto ja nejako uvažujem, a je to také, je to veľmi pekné počuť, že mať také povzbudenie v tom, že fakt, že čo je gro tej našej práce, a podľa mňa ešte v tých našich krajinách, možno je to iba taký môj obrázok, je v tom Českej a Slovenskej republiky, že ešte je to o tom, že ja si nemôžem v rámci neziskovej organizácie dovoliť robiť iba ten street work, a že proste myslím na tých viacerých úrovniach, a je to veľmi ťažké, a potom je to veľmi ťažké aj potom v tom hodnotení, pretože zároveň som street worker, kde mám hájiť to, že toto je môj job a ja som tu a teraz s klientom, a to je najdôležitejšie, a zároveň som koordinátorkou a fundraiserkou, ktorá zháňa prachy a potrebuje povedať, že takéto sú výsledky a má to takéto ako výhody. Takže tak.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Yes, I would like to know whether anyone here wants to say if you're in one of these phases. I'm interested, you say that the Czech Republic and Slovakia might be behind. I recognise that. In the UK, we're always behind the USA. I say behind in inverted commas because I want to hold on to practice-based evaluation and fight against very narrow governance agendas. But unfortunately, I would not... If this picture I've spoken about today is not recognisable to people in this room, I wonder if it will be in a few years. Hopefully not, but I wonder if it will be, and it's good to have advance warning. If I spoke to a group of street workers about this 5 years ago in England, they would recognise the targets, but they wouldn't understand about this measuring before and after. This is a very new thing for us. Maybe 5 people in the room would know it, and the other 50 would not know. And the last thing I wanted to mention from what you've said is about our work being broader than street work. I really understand that. I don't think street work's the only good practice in the world. However, I think street work is particularly vulnerable to the neoliberalisation of politics and economics. I think it's very hard to justify street work. So while, yes, we should do many things, I think it's really important to fight for that space for street work as a really important part of social practices. Thank you for your contribution. I think we have 5 minutes left before the next speaker. If anyone would like to reflect on what phase you are here or anything else. Otherwise, we can finish. Okay, thank you. Well, feel free to come and talk to me or email me anytime. Thank you very much for listening.